Welcome back to another Unreal Engine 4 tutorial, and well, this is the first episode of the building series. I did this for the survival game series a couple of years ago, but now this system is going to be way more advanced. It's going to be way more simpler to move this around to other projects, and it's going to have way more features. And by the end of today's video, we're not going to have much, but we're going to have some base functions down, and we're going to be able to look at the preview. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So really quickly, the first thing, let me show you some assets that I have. So these are the assets. I have some doors, floor, foundation, foundation extensions, some pillars, walls with holes for doors and windows, and the windows and well, windows and doors themselves as well. All of these assets are down in the description box down below, and they are not the FBX files. These are just the UAsset files. So what you need to do is open up that archive that you downloaded, and then go locate your content folder of your project and just bring in that assets folder over here, and it's gonna work just fine. Maybe you will need to restart the Unreal Engine, but I doubt it. It should work just fine. And yeah, you're gonna have these exact same assets. Now let's go ahead, let's start with the tutorial. So first, let me create a build component so that it later in the future it would be easier us for to basically take this whole system and bring it into a completely different project. Now, if you're following this tutorial, make sure you start this with a brand new project. Don't do this in your own project. It's always better to experiment and test things in a separate project, because later down the road, probably in the final, very final episode, we are going to be bringing this whole thing from this project into an entirely different project. It's probably going to happen from this one into my free inventory system, and then we're going to combine that with the inventory in the following tutorials as well. So with that being said, let's go ahead, let's create ourselves a new blueprint class, and we need ourselves a actor component which will be able to attach to the character, and this is going to hold most of the logic. So let's call this build component. There we go. We can open this up. Let's attach it to over here. Now, all good. I'm gonna remove these events for now, and let's go ahead, let's dive into our third person character straight away, and let's make sure that we have this component attached to our character. And to do so, all we need to do is add a component, and let's look for our build component. There we go. As simple as that. Now we need to set up a couple of things in our build component itself. So what we need to do is create a bunch of variables and a bunch of functions. So let's start with the variables. The first one, I'm going to call this is build mode on, which is going to obviously represent whether the build mode is on or off. This is going to be a Boolean. And the next one is going to be called can build, which is also going to be a Boolean, and this simply will represent whether we are allowed to build in that specific place. Now the next one that we need is we're going to need a build ID. We're probably not going to use this in this video, but in the following one we are, and this needs to be an integer. Let's create ourselves another variable. This is very important. We need a build transform, so that we know the location, rotation, and scale of the object. Where are we going to place this in the world? And this one needs to be a transform type of variable. Now, the next variable, we need our player reference. Now, I'm using a third-person character. If you're using a different one, but like I said, probably it's better to do this in a new project. So use the third-person character, and then later on, when we are going to transfer this to another project, we are going to change this reference to the new character, whatever it might be. But in this case, this is just a third-person character type. We need to specify a specific type so that we don't need to waste our time with a lot of interfaces, so that we can just grab the information that we need from our character. So those are the most important pieces for now. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more later on. Now, one more variable that we do need to add to this whole thing is a camera component. So let's go ahead, let's call this camera, and this variable's type is a camera component. There we go. So it's not going to be in the variables usually, it's going to be under the components tab, like this one right here, and we will need this so that we know from where to shoot our line trace. Now real quick, for this to work, let's head back to our third person character real quick, and over here what we want to do is create ourselves a begin play event. And whenever we start the game, what we want to do is we want to bring in our build component. And for this build component, we want to set the camera variable. Set camera. And for the camera, obviously use whatever camera that you are running. I'm running the follow camera. If you have a variable that is used for like the change of the camera from third person to first person, use that variable instead. So basically this is the reference to the active camera which we are using so that the system knows from where to do the line tracing. Here we go. So that's out of the way. Let's head back into our build component over here, and well, let's get ourselves a player's reference first. So over here on begin play, what we are going to do is we are going to cast to the character, cast to the third person character. Also, we could obviously do this inside of the third person character itself as well, but I'm just going to do it like this. What I'm going to do is just simply get the actors, not the actors, get the component's owner, because we are in a component right here. So we need this component's owner. So this is the owner. Our third person character is the owner of this component since this is attached to our character. And then we can set our player reference. So now we're going to be able to access the player's variables from anywhere inside of this component quite easily. There we go. So the next thing, let's create a bunch of functions that we're going to use throughout this whole thing. So the first one is going to be the spawn build ghost, which is going to spawn the preview that we're going to see moving around in the world, and then we can accept it, and it's going to spawn the object exactly in that same position. Now over here, what we want to do is bring in our player's reference because we want to attach that to our player. We can't attach it to our build component. We need to attach that to our character. So what we're going to do is from the player's reference, we are going to add a component by class. There we go. Now we need to specify a class, and the class for this is going to be a static mesh component class, this one right here. And then it requires us to have some kind of a transform. So for the transform, we can then just use the build transform. So we want to get that and plug that in. There we go. Now the next thing, we want to keep tabs on this component. We want to keep it in our memory. So from the return value, let's promote that to a variable, and let's call this build ghost. There we go. So we have that. And the next one that we need is we need to set the mesh for this component, because by default it's going to be an empty component without any mesh. So from the build ghost, we want to set static mesh. And for now, obviously we're going to populate this with a dynamic one, but for now, let's just hard code one in, and I'm just going to use the foundation for this for now. Now after this, we need one more configuration for our build ghost. We need to disable the collision for this, because by default it's going to have a collision, and obviously we don't want it to bump the other characters around, bump the other objects that might have physics around. So what we're going to do is we're just going to simply set the collision enabled to have no collision whatsoever, because this build ghost doesn't need to have any collisions. Now, the next one, we need to give a different color to this buildable so that we know whether we are allowed or we're not allowed to build visually, essentially. And for that, we need a bunch of materials. So what I'm going to do is in our assets folder, I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to call this green color. Let's open this up. I'm going to hold keyboard key number 3 to get a constant 3, plug that into the base color, and change this to be green color. Like this. And then I also want to give this some opacity, so I'm going to change the blend mode to be translucent, and I'm going to hold 1 and click to get a constant 1. I'm going to plug that into opacity, and I'm going to give this the opacity of 0.5, so it's a little bit transparent. Then we can save this, and I'm going to do this 2 more times because I will also need a red color. So the green one is going to tell you're allowed to build, the red one is going to tell that we're not allowed to build, and the gray one, we're going to use that later when we place the build down, and then we need to bring the materials to it to finish the build essentially. So I'm going to Control W to duplicate this. This is going to be the red color, and I'm going to do another one, saving, I'm going to do another one for the gray color. So I'm going to skip this bit right here, just simply change up the color, and it's going to be just fine. So this is 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, good. And that's going to be 1 at red and 0 at green channel. There we go. So 100 is a red color. So we're all good with these materials. Yes, save those. There we go. So now we need to create ourselves a function which is going to change this color for us. So let's go ahead, again, new function, and I'm going to call this give build color. Here we go. Now from here, we're going to need a single input, which is going to tell us which color, because this function is going to change one of the two colors. It's going to make it red or green, depending on whether we're allowed to build. And I'm going to call this just is green, and it's going to be a boolean, and it's going to tell us green or red, essentially. Now, the next thing, let's get our build ghost, and we got to figure out how many materials it actually has, because many models could consist of many materials, and we want to make sure that we change the color for all of them, not just one. So from here, I'm going to get the num materials, the number of materials. So it's going to tell me how many are there. And what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to do -1, because I'm going to do a loop through all of them. But this is going to start with 1, 2, 3, but the loop starts with 0. So I'm just going to do a regular for loop. So regular flow control for loop, like this one. And this is going to be our last index, like so. Now from there, we can do an if from is green, and we can connect that to the loop body. So it's going to go through all of the materials, and for every single one of them, it's going to check whether it needs to be green or red. Now, the next thing is grabbing our build ghost itself. So let's get that. And from here, we want to set the material. So we want to set its material, plug that into true. And so is green true? So that means that the material needs to be the green color. And the element index is the index from the loop, like this one. There we go. So we have that out of the way. And let's go ahead and let's create another one. My key is stuck. Here we go. There we go. So this is false. And then the index element index is the same. The target is the same, but the material in this one is the red. There we go. Now the last thing in this function right here is after it has completed its loop, after it has changed all of its materials, from the completion we want to set the world transform. We need to bring in the build ghost, I guess, first, and then from there we can set world transform. Set world transform, connect that to the complete. So whenever the loop is complete, then we can set up the build transform like this. And we also need to tell whether we are allowed or not allowed to build. So at the very beginning over here, let's just go ahead and let's set can build to be this variable is green, and it's going to tell us whether we are or not allowed to build right now. There we go. So this function is completed. Let's go ahead and let's start creating our actual build cycle, which is going to go through it's going to tell us where we can essentially build this object. So let's create ourselves this function. I'm going to call this build cycle. From here, let's get our camera component, and then we want to get its world location, and we also want to get the forward vector from that. Here we go. Now the next thing is we want to multiply our forward vector with float or integer. I'm going to use integer. So basically how many units further from the character it should do the line trace. I'm going to do 1000 units, and then I can combine both of these together. So vector plus vector, so the world location plus the forward vector times 1000, it's going to have the line trace 1000 units in front of our character. And I'm going to actually copy these two nodes once more, connect them the same way, like this and like this. But I'm going to change this 1000 value into a 350. Why 350? That is because I want to do a line trace from the front of my character up until 1000 units in front of my character, because by default the camera boom is the arm length is 300 units, so the camera is 300 units behind our character. So I want to do a line trace from over here forward. So that's what this essentially will do. So from the build cycle we can then do a line trace by channel, and we can plug those in. So the 351 is the start and the 1001 is the end position. Now after this, from the return value, let's do an if to see if we actually hit something. Let's break the out hit result so that we get the data about what have we hit. And then the next step is to set up the transform. So let's go ahead and let's set the transform, build transform for both of these paths, for the true and for the false. So whenever we hit something and whenever we don't, let's right click this pin so we can split and get all its values. So the location, rotation, and the scale. And what we want to do over here actually is get the build transform, split that, and reuse the current rotation and scale that we have already. So go ahead, plug both of those in like this and like this. There we go. And then we want to use for if we hit something, if it's true, then the location is going to be the impact point. So that's where we are looking at, that's where we are placing our build. But if we don't hit anything, then we can just simply use the trace endpoint like this. There we go. So that's set up. Now the next step is actually spawning our preview, but first, before we can actually spawn it, we gotta get our build ghost, and we want to check whether it is valid with a question mark, so it gives us an execution pin. And we actually want to do this on both of these paths. We want to do this on true and on false when we hit something and when we don't, and we want to check whether the build ghost is valid in both occasions. Now if it is not valid, then we want to spawn it. So let's bring in our spawn build ghost function. And from not valid, we are going to spawn it, like so. Now from the is valid points, we want to run the give build color. Now from the top one, is green should be true, since we have hit something, so we are allowed to build at that point. Now let's copy and paste this over once more. For the other is valid, but this one needs to be false, since we didn't hit anything, so we're probably looking at the sky, and we don't want to build things in the sky. We only want to build something whenever we have hit something. Right now we're going to be able to build on walls as well, but don't worry about that. We're going to fix all of those issues later on. For now, this is just very basic setup so that we can get up and running quickly. Now we need to do a loop, which will basically run this thing over and over and over again. So it would change its position, change its rotations, locations, all that stuff. So let's go to our event graph of our build component, and let's create ourselves a new custom event. And I'm going to call this build delay. So this is going to be our relay kind of, which is going to rerun this thing all over again and again and again. So over here, let's do an if. And let's check whether our build mode is still on, because if it's not, well, then we should destroy the preview and be done with this build mode. Now, if it's true, if our build mode is still on, let's do a tiny delay of like 0.1 seconds, because we don't need to run this every frame. We should save frames, save the performance. So we're going to do this. And then after that, we're going to rerun our build cycle. Now, once you move the mouse and the preview is not smooth enough, maybe bring this down to like 0.05, but 0.1 usually seem to work really good for me. Now from the false route, what we want to do is disable all of our variables, set them all to false, destroy the build ghost. So from the false, let's set our build mode to be false, even though if it's already false, but don't worry about that, because we're going to have another custom event so that we can run this path right here. So then after this, let's set a can build to be false as well. And then we want to check whether our build ghost, so let's get that. We want to see if it's still valid, so basically whether it is still existing. Now, if it is, then we are going to want to destroy that. But for that, we need to do that inside of our character. Otherwise, this gave me some issues with the multiplayer part of things. So in our third-person character, in the event graph, let's go ahead, let's create ourselves another custom event, and let's call this destroy component. There we go. And from here, we want to look for a node destroy component. Destroy component. So select any of these ones, and then just simply delete the target like this, because it doesn't really want to, doesn't seem to want to give us a free node. It just wants to rerun this function. So from the target, go ahead and plug that in like so. Compile and save this, and this is good to go. So now back in our build component, if we would grab our player's reference, now we are able to access that event. So we can look for our destroy component function, event rather, connect this to is valid, and then the build ghost is the bottom target. Now let's rename this maybe a little bit. So in the third person character, select this and change maybe this to the component, so it's a little bit more understandable. So now back in the build component, it requires us a component, not two targets. So that's going to make the understanding of this a little bit more simpler. Now I said here we're going to have something that basically stops our build mode. So for that, again, let's create ourselves another custom event and let's call this stop build mode. And let's plug that into over here. So whenever we're going to run this event, it's just simply going to disable our build mode really quickly and very simple. Now, the next thing is actually getting this thing up and running. So again, in our build component, another custom event, and let's call this launch build mode. So this is essentially going to start our build mode. So from here, what we want to do is do an if, so that we have like a toggle switch which turns on and off our build mode. So we're going to check whether our build mode is already on at this point. And then if it's true, then we can just simply stop the build mode like this. Stop our build mode. It's going to run this and disable it. But if it's false, if our build mode is not on, then what we want to do is we want to set our variable is build mode on to be true, since we are turning it on. And then the next one is running our build cycle. There we go. Now we need to plug in our build delay, like this relay, into our build cycle. So let's open up our build cycle function. And at the end over here, let's just run our, let's look for our build delay and plug it into all of these executions right here. So it would create us an infinite loop and constantly keep on changing the position of the buildable. There we go. Now, last few steps to get this up and running would be in our third person character. Let's go ahead and let's create ourselves some kind of an event, key event, which is going to launch our build mode. So I'm going to use a keyboard B key for this. Then we can grab our build component and we can launch the build mode like this. So now at this point, we're going to have a working preview. So if we hit play, let's make this a little bit bigger, hit B. As you can see, we have our preview over here. So we can't build it up in the air, as you can see, but we can, it allows us to build it on the ground. So like I said, it still allows us to build within the walls because it does hit something, but don't worry about it. We're going to fix that later on, and we're not going to be able to do anything like that. So that's going to be it for today's episode. We have the preview up and running. In the next episode, we're going to work some more so we have more these actual buildables. So it's a little bit more easier to implement more buildables, because right now it's only just one hard coded value. We're going to have a bunch of those. We're going to be able to change those, and we're going to be able to place those actually down on the ground as well. Now, as you see, the preview is a little bit twitchy. It's a little bit laggy. So like I said, if you want it to be smoother, go ahead and in your build component, in the build delay, this one right here, bring this down to like 0.05. So then this is going to be a little bit more smoother, or maybe even 0.01. Now you can see this is super smooth. It's totally up to you, but just know the faster the delay, the more the performance issue kind of thing. It's not like a huge thing. It's more so on the CPU, I think, rather than the GPU. So don't really worry about that too much, but you can also obviously always create that as a setting. Yeah. You can always make that into a setting and allow players to decide how fast they want to do this on their own. So that's going to be it for today's video. If you found this useful and helpful, make sure to subscribe, because there's going to be a lot of episodes just like this. If you enjoy my work, have some free cash, feel free to subscribe to my Patreon. The download files, the downloads for these files are over there, so you can download the project files, have a look at them. There's also, if this series is not yet out completely, then on the Patreon there is a bunch of more episodes already available. Feel free to join my Discord as well. That's completely free. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I see you in the next one.